Good evening, Seaside Shadows, and welcome to another edition of Spooky Story Sunday. Tonight, I'm here with a most fascinating tale that has some pretty old Connecticut roots, even though many of us would be familiar with the tale coming from the West Coast, and here we are in Little New England on the East Coast. And many of the stories we talk about, and stories that I have always had a passion for, are about spirits, the paranormal, ghosts of human beings coming from the past to communicate with us, or perhaps getting glimpses of another time through the paranormal, of at least a human time. But another large part in the world of the spooky and the paranormal are stories of supernatural creatures. Now, if you visit us in Mystic and you take any of our tours, you may be familiar with a supernatural creature that resides there, whose name I will not spoil. But a creature that you may be even more familiar with from tales of at least decades is the creature known as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Now, Sasquatch came to fame at first in the 1950s, and the story came out from the West Coast, and it became the Bigfoot story because of the big feet imprints of a creature that were found. Sadly, however, that particular case was proven to be a hoax that was created by the initial storyteller. But that didn't stop the idea that there was this man or creature or woman or thing that resided in the woods somewhere between ape and human. And the reason it didn't stop that is, even though that may have been a hoax, the legends of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch creature date back much further than the 1950s. They date back centuries. And in fact, many Native American communities were so certain that there were these creatures in the woods that Sasquatch is derived from a Native American word. And they were even so certain of these creatures' sounds that they had forbidden areas and forbidden places. Just knowing that they existed out there was part of common life for many Native American tribes hundreds of years ago. So it's no strange thing as we get into the 1800s in America and the population has increased and people are starting to come in on more and more areas that had previously been woodlands, that more creatures are starting to be seen. They had gotten familiar with bears and things like that in the woods, but the new European settlers were by no means familiar with what the natives were familiar with, this half-man, half-ape creature. It became incredibly shocking when a lot of the stories that were known from Western Native American cultures started being told here in New England. And in the 1800s, a story arose that has haunted Connecticut and become a thing of legend. Now, before Bigfoot or Sasquatch was even called such a thing, it was believed that it was a form of human, and perhaps it still is, that was covered in hair and had this crazy appearance, wild. So they would call the Bigfoot Wild Man. And the story of one of the first wild men that is at least talked about publicly in Connecticut comes from the town of Winsted, and that is up in Litchfield County. Of course, it's beautifully mountainous up there, and there's something quiet, and we've come to you from Litchfield before for Cemetery Saturday, so that doesn't surprise me that the Winsted Wild Man runs rampant. Now, what happened was this story originates in 1895. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened in 1895 and let you make, of course, your own assumptions. But in 1895, the story came from a local man. It came on a very warm a hot summer day. It was in August, but here we are in late July. We are experiencing a heat wave. We know what that sultry weather is like, and if you're outside doing any sort of work, odds are that you could even, maybe think you see a bigfoot creature of your own. So, we always take with a grain of salt. But the sighting came from a town official in Winsted named Riley Smith. Riley Smith was the one who reported the sighting. However, once he did, other people from the town came forward and said that they saw it too. And it was eventually published in a book in 1929, but it did make the news in 1895 in a publication called the Winsted Herald. Now, according to the story, Mr. Riley Smith was outside, and they describe him as a powerful but wiry man and having a reputation for having lots of sand, and his bulldog was known for his pluck. So he had a pet bulldog that was particularly unafraid of anything. And what he states is that they were out picking blueberries, which we might do on a hot summer day just this time of year. Mine haven't grown in yet, but I digress. And his bulldog, again noted for its ferociousness, began to whine and cry, and suddenly stationed itself, according to the paper, between Mr. Smith's legs, cowering underneath him as if in fear. As soon as he noticed his dog's strange behavior and that his dog was hiding underneath him, he looked up to see what all the fuss was about, and he was shocked to find that there was a large man in front of him who appeared to be stark naked except for being covered with hair all over his body. And they said that he ran out of a clump of bushes when he appeared, and then started to make all these strange sounds that were not discernible as anything that the selectmen there would recognize. And he made a run for the woods, Mr. Smith said, at lightning speed. He estimated that the creature or person was at least 6 feet tall and ran upright with a posture like a human. Now, this was of a great concern when this came forward, and other people in town started saying they saw the same thing out their kitchen windows or walking through their yard. And of course, it makes the local newspaper, the Wild Man, that started being seen all over town. Now, this then attracts the interest of newspapers from New York and Boston, and people came from all over the Northeast to Winsted on the train to write about the incident and try to capture a glimpse of the Wild Man. But none of the reporters were able to do so. And according to one of the locals, all they went home with were sunburns and hangovers from the local beer. The townsfolk were scared, however, and they were insistent that this half man, half creature, this wild man existed, and due to his frightening appearance, the only thing they could think of was that he was a threat. Who makes strange sounds and runs out of bushes and runs around that way. So they assembled a posse to go hunt the creature. And you'll have to excuse my reference, but I imagine it a lot like this, and hopefully, there's someone else out there that sees it that way too. But it makes me think of Beauty and the Beast, right? They hear that there's this beast-like creature they don't understand, and the whole town gets their torches and pitchforks, and they run to find the beast and hunt it. And I imagine a similar scene in this small town in 1800s Connecticut. And they send out a posse to go find it, but much like the reporters, they do not find the said creature. They continued to speculate on who it was, and then a theory came about. And the theory was that it was a man who had been in an insane asylum in New York in 1894. He had escaped the asylum. He was an artist, and He was found, however, 6 months later in Cuba, living in the tropics, eating raw fruits. Some assumed that it was him, but then the stories went on to say that the man, though insane and having run away, and he was also found naked in Cuba, so I guess that, might explain the stark naked appearance. He would have been in Cuba, not in Connecticut, and oddly also, he was not reported to be a particularly hairy man. In fact, they reported that he had very little hair at all. So that wouldn't follow the theory of what they saw in 1895 in Winsted. Now, there are some locals who say the story kind of was embellished upon by the local news reporter, that he had gotten caught embellishing stories before. So can we say that maybe he made it more than what the selectmen saw? It's hard to say, because the stories come back, and they come back almost 80 years after the initial sighting by Selectman Smith while he was picking blueberries. And they come back in an area that I am happy to report is actually named Camp Crystal Lake. And it comes in the 70s that this creature is there. And I can't help but wonder if there's any influence to one of our favorite horror series of having a creature in the woods that's dangerous by a Camp Crystal Lake. I must think there's something to it. But in the 70s, he had quite a few appearances. And I'm going to read to you a bit from Legendary Connecticut about some of those appearances in the 70s. There's many accounts of the Winsted Wild Man, but this one documents the 70s quite well because that's when the book was written. It says, while the wild man may have made intermediate appearances between 1895 and the early 1970s, he attracted press attention in late July of 72. So it's just this time of year you should be looking for the wild man by these accounts. When reports came from Winsted that a strange man-like creature had been spotted early morning by two young men on the Winchester Road near Crystal Lake Reservoir. It seems that Wayne Hall, who was 19 of the Winchester Road, and his friend David Chapman, who was 18, were at Chapman's house, sitting up late and talking on the night of July 24th. We're very close, aren't we? Early the following morning, the young men were startled by, quote, weird noises outside, end quote. It sounded, they said, like the mix of a frog and a cat together. Sounds like when a frog blows up and makes a lot of noise. The two friends looked out the window in the direction of Crystal Lake and at some distance saw what both described as a figure, not 6 feet tall, but 8 feet tall and covered with hair. Because of the distance and the dim light, however, they could only make out arms, legs, and a head. No face was visible. As the two youths watched from the window, the wild man came out of the thick woods from the area of Crystal Lake, crossed the road, and entered the shadows near a lighted barn, where Albert Durant of Winsted kept race horses. It kind of stooped, one of the teenagers reported, but more upright. It was hairy, I would say, and black hair. It never crouched down, always upright, and once in a while would reach up to seemingly scratch its head. Asked if it might have been a large black bear, he replied, "It's no bear." They observed the monster for, they said, 45 minutes in total, as it alternately entered and emerged from the shadows around the barn. Finally, it went back across the road and into the dark woods toward Crystal Lake. A little more than 2 years later, in September of 74, the Winsted wild man was spotted again, this time when he came out of the woods early in the morning of September 27th, and struck terror into the hearts of two couples who had been parking near the Rug Brook Reservoir. Press accounts of the sighting quoted Winsted patrolman, a police officer, George Corso, who, while cruising about at 2:30 a.m. on Main Street, had been flagged down by two obviously agitated Harwinton men and told about their very recent encounter with, now he's shrunken again, a 6-foot, 300-pound creature with dark-colored hair at the edge of the reservoir. They were absolutely terrified, the police officer reported, and he believed their terror to be truly genuine. And he said one of them persuaded the police officer, in his fear, to return with him to the spot where the wild man had been seen. The young man insisted that all the cruiser doors be locked before they left town for the 3-mile drive. Although the officer thought that a creature as large as the one described could rip off the cruiser's doors whether they were locked or not, he humored the youth anyway. He was shook, is all the officer could say. As they drove toward the reservoir, the informant told the policeman that earlier in the evening he and his friend and their dates had decided to park for a time by the lake. It had been a bright moonlit night. After they stopped, one of the men got out of the car, and suddenly he saw the creature emerge from the nearby woods and start to walk toward the car, its eyes eerie in the reflected moonlight. You know that glow when your headlights or a light hits the light of an animal and you know they're close, but you can't quite see what it is. Kind of like that, I imagine. The young man leaped back into the car, and the badly frightened foursome beat a hasty retreat. When the squad car finally reached the reservoir embankment, going back to the site where the monster had been seen, the young man suddenly shouted, "There it is now, don't stop." The police officer quickly turned the cruiser around, and though he carefully searched the area to the water's edge with his spotlight, he saw nothing. Although he gave up the fruitless night search after sunrise, Corso returned to the scene of the sighting, along with a reporter. Neither could find any sign of what the couples had witnessed. Not even a giant footprint in the brush-covered hard gravel surface of the reservoir. The police concluded that the Parkers must have seen a black bear, but everyone agreed that they had seen something unusual. The Winsted desk sergeant, David Gomez, remembered that the young man who made the initial report told him before returning to Harwinton, "I will never in my life go there again." Now, the stories go quiet for a bit, and they resurrect in the early 2000s with a variety of people in the same area saying that they have seen the same described creature. Now, there's jokes in town. Is it the same family of creatures and this is just 3 or 4 generations of them? Is the timing strange? You have the 1800s where you have a news reporter who likes embellishment. You have the 1970s when a bunch of Bigfoot movies actually come to the big screen and Bigfoot starts to be talked about. And then you have, a more modern era where people start to resurrect these legends. But all these different people found themselves not out there seeking such a thing, and so desperate that they would call a police officer, or that they would be a publicly elected official who would report it himself to the news, or just a couple of kids who had nothing to gain or lose by saying what they saw. That might add some credibility to the wild man of Winsted. And what adds credibility to me with any good legend is that it never originated from a hoax. It originated from the native people who lived in the woods. And they heard those sounds, maybe a mix of a frog and a cat. They heard sounds that were slightly human-like. They saw things that they knew coexisted and that they would give space. So when you look out at the woods at night, in your yard or when you're driving by, maybe, just maybe, you'll see the wild creatures that have not officially been named other than in legend, and you'll be the next account. That is this evening's Spooky Story Sunday, the tale of the Winsted Wild Man. We sourced Legendary Connecticut and a variety of other sources of accounts that are available, and we encourage you to read some of the exciting ones. We hope to see you next month. We are doing 1 segment a week, as we have 4 different kinds. Next week, Andrew and I will be there to do a Q&A session with you. If we are not there on Monday, we will reschedule it. Why wouldn't we be there on Monday, you say? Well, we are booking private tours at this time, and a lot of times Monday nights get booked up. But we will be there next week, and we will make sure that we have a segment for you. We encourage you and ask you kindly to share these segments if you like them on your favorite social media platform, and to subscribe to us on YouTube. And you can always send tips if available. Our tours and special events are running in Mystic, and they can be booked at seasideshadows.com. Thank you, and keep an eye out your windows tonight. You never know who's out there.